Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, Xi Jinping is in Moscow, and boy, are the Americans unhappy. Oh man, they are extremely unhappy. It has long been said by Kissinger and other sort of, international diplomats that the worst mistake that the US could ever make would be to force China and Russia into an alliance with each other, and it looks like that is exactly what has happened. Xi Jinping is over in Moscow. At the moment, the meeting has just basically wrapped up. In case you think I just focus on RT, yes, look, it's the New York Times as well. The paper of record, the Atlanticist shill see. I do read stuff from both sides. I just think that the New York Times is shit, basically. But they've got like all kinds of like stories on this page, and oh my god, the Americans are just insanely salty. The original aim was supposedly for Xi Jinping and the Chinese to basically broker a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. Now, of course, this is absolutely not going to happen, as the Americans would say, over my dead body. Or to put it in the words of Foreign Secretary Antony Blinken, we ain't doing that. Here, check this out.
And a ceasefire now, without a durable solution, would allow President Putin to rest and refit his troops and then restart the war at a time more advantageous to Russia. The world should not be fooled by any tactical move by Russia, supported by China or any other country, to freeze the war on its own terms. Such a move would violate the UN Charter and defy the will of 141 countries who have condemned Russia's war in the United Nations General Assembly.
Ah, yes, the UN Charter. That thing that the US always respects, unless it becomes inconvenient and they ignore it entirely. Does anyone remember Iraq or Libya or Syria or any of those other wars that, the US started with, hardly unanimous support? So, essentially, the Americans are saying, no. Like, I mean, sure, we want peace, but only after we have completely destroyed and dismembered Russia. I mean, this is basically their stated goal, to replace the Russian government and to break it up into a bunch of smaller countries, which is one of the reasons why the Russians view this as an existential threat. So the Americans are very, very displeased. Now, even if Xi and Putin come up with some kind of a peace deal, everybody knows that it is not the Chinese that the Ukrainians are listening to. It's not the Chinese paying the Ukrainians billions of dollars and giving them all of the weapons to fight their wars. No, it's the Americans and the Europeans to a lesser extent. Therefore, unless the Americans agree to a peace deal, there isn't going to be one. However, by publishing a peace deal that Russia would accept, negotiated with the Chinese, it would be a tremendous PR blow to the Americans, right? You recall perhaps the PR damage that the US and the UK sustained when it was revealed that back in January last year, I believe, sometime last year, the Ukrainians did have a peace deal and they were about to go through with it. And Boris Johnson flew out from London to Kiev to make sure that it didn't happen. So if, Putin agrees to a peace deal and the Chinese basically sort of, back it, and then of course the Americans are like, no, we're not going to do that, it's going to make the Americans look very, very bad, number one, and it will set a framework by which a stick that the Chinese will be able to beat the Americans with, saying, look, you clearly don't want peace, we've got like a deal. Xi is apparently trying to set up a meeting with Zelensky, but Zelensky is not picking up his phone. Gee, I wonder why. Must be bad mobile reception in Kiev, I guess. Definitely nothing to do with the fact that they clearly don't want a peace deal. The more cynical part of me would say, well, they haven't killed enough people yet. Oh my God. In an attempt to sort of disrupt this new harmony between China and Russia, which does seem to be like, really getting on. Of course, there's a lot of diplomatic speak. They're all like, oh, dear President Putin, I always call you my dear friend. I mean, you could watch this on Twitter if you want, but it's pretty boring. It's just a bunch of like what I like to call diplomatic cocksucking, where two leaders will get in front of a camera and just say, oh yes, you've always been friends with us. Yes, we have always been friends with you. No. Now, of course, this comes on the back of the historic peace deal that the Chinese negotiated between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The Shia and the Sunni, right? Two factions of Islam that have been at each other's throats for ages. Iran and Saudi Arabia have been prosecuting a war in Yemen for, God, I don't know how many years that's been going on for. And now there is peace thanks to the Chinese. In other words, at the moment anyway, the Chinese are eating the Americans' lunch. There is also a bunch of African leaders at the moment in China as well. China seems to be stepping up to take over as the sort of hegemon that does all the deals and, make sure that everyone keeps their toys in their own corners, a role that up till now was exclusively the domain of the US. So, of course, the Americans are going to be very, very salty. Now, in case you're watching this on YouTube, and you're one of those people who's like, oh my God, you just love Russia so much. Dude, the Americans and the West could just do better. Like, seriously, right? The West and America, they used to be great at diplomacy, right? Now, not so much, right? Like, it's very, very clear that the current US administration has no interest in ending the war in Ukraine. There have been multiple opportunities where they could have stopped the war from starting, where they could have stopped it, and it's clearly not in their interest. A lot of them, they just hate the Russians. Now, look, that might be a reasonable position, right? But it's a war, right? A war that, for all accounts, right, despite all of the copium, Ukraine is totally losing. And their advance has ground to a halt. They haven't managed to take back practically any territory in the last, God knows how many months. It looks like they're losing. Now would be a good time to sue for peace. You never know. They might be able to convince the Russians to let them keep all the territory that, they have left at the moment. But of course, from the Ukrainian perspective, the only possible outcome is the complete restoration of the borders of Ukraine pre the annexing of Crimea, which of course is never going to happen. Everybody knows it's not going to happen. It's one of those things when you're doing negotiating, if you don't want the negotiation to succeed, you deliberately set a condition that your opponent is unable to fulfill, and thus you can keep it going. Ukraine is hardly negotiating from a position of strength here. Of course, the economic sanctions on Russia were supposed to crush its economy. It now looks like they've had basically the opposite effect, allowing Russia to pivot to trade with China, Iran and other countries, and also insulating Russia from the massive Western banking collapse that's going on at the moment. It is uncanny. Certain people are wondering whether this was a 4D chess move. It certainly would not have taken a crystal ball to realize that the first thing that the West would do when the war kicked off is sanction the hell out of everything Russian. The West has a long track record with this. Simply look at Iran. It makes me wonder whether the Russians learned from the Iranians in how to, insulate their economy from this kind of stuff. So, in a desperate attempt to attack Putin, there has been the whole ICC warrant. I did a video of that on Rumble. It's not up on YouTube. The US Justice Department is, embraces supporting a role in pursuing war crimes in Ukraine. Not in Iraq, though, or Afghanistan, or Libya, right? I would have a lot more respect for these international institutions if they were either, one, impartial, or two, worked the way they were originally designed, which was that every country on the UN Permanent Security Council, all of the nuclear powers, just get a pass, right? That's the way it functionally worked since the end of the Second World War, right? You could do all this kind of stuff to smaller countries, but the 5 permanent members, right, all had a veto. You couldn't do shit to them, and there was a good reason why it was designed that way, so you didn't get another world war. Honestly, bros, I think the Americans have bitten off more than they can chew at this point. The West is, straining its supply lines when it comes to ammunition, particularly artillery ammunition. They may be able to like turn that around. I don't know. But certainly at the moment, there are severe blockages in getting ammunition to Ukraine. And that's before you consider the personnel shortages. Although, of course, all of the people who are like rah Ukraine insist that, casualties have been low and, there's, so many more Ukrainian men they could send to the front. However, I'm not seeing any indications of that. What I'm seeing on the ground, obviously I'm not there in Ukraine. What I'm seeing is that the Ukrainians are running out of men and material, and they can have all the artillery rounds they want if they don't have enough men to fire them. This sort of to and fro between the West and now the China-Russia bloc, which I think is basically analogous to a new Cold War, really, right? Is putting certain third countries in a bit of a bind, most notably Japan, who on the one hand is being told by China and Russia, hey, we would really like you to de-escalate things, and being told by the West, we need you to escalate stuff. So Prime Minister Fumio Kishida of Japan is in Kiev at the moment, obviously indicating that he is, trying to please the West. But we are going to wind up with a situation very similar to what happened during the Cold War. Now, when the Cold War was on and the world sort of like was, composed of two large power blocks, you had a lot of smaller countries that would essentially try and play these power blocks off against one another. They do a little bit for the Soviet Union, they do a little bit for the Americans, you know what I mean? They try not to pick a side, but sort of stay not exactly neutral, but, do a little bit here and a little bit there and try and avoid getting sucked into either block. And I think we are about to see a massive resurgence of this general dynamic in the world. I expect a bunch of smaller countries to essentially declare that they are sort of non-aligned. African countries especially, because they can then essentially court both the Russia-Chinese bloc, I guess the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO, I guess they're going to call it, although the Americans will probably call it the, what would the Americans call it? The Block of Hate is probably what they'll call it. Because hate is bad. And everyone knows that we need to stop hate. This block of hate does have a lot of nuclear weapons, but hey, right? To defeat hate, the supreme sacrifice must be demanded. I don't know what the Americans are going to do, to be perfectly honest, bros. All indications seem to suggest that despite their sort of vast military materiel, the composition of the US armed forces has declined precipitously. What with all of the purges, there was one purge over political ideology where they basically fired anyone who had so much as ever posted a Pepe the Frog meme. And then there was another purge over people who didn't want to take the vaccine. And then there was sort of a massive sucking sound as they sort of recruited a bunch of, woke retards to take over the jobs that all the cisgender, white, hetero, patriarchal men had left. And apparently, bros, it turns out that these aren't the kind of people that you want in the army. Things have gotten so bad that, in fact, the US Army has had to pivot to actually putting, dare I say it, white men back in their recruitment commercials. Can't believe it, bros. Have we stopped progressing? Are we just going back? Oh my God. The more sort of jaded segment of the population who, is definitely who they're trying to target, is basically saying that why would I go and die in Ukraine? Especially when there's no esprit de corps, and after the last, God, how long has it been? 5-7 years of massive anti-white sentiment in the US that culminated in the sort of BLM riots in 2021. So what's going to happen? God, I don't know, but things are definitely changing. I think the US is about to discover that it's bitten off more than it can chew, and I would be willing to bet that the Chinese and the Russians both predicted that the US would bite off more than it could chew quite accurately, because the US has just been doing this kind of stuff for ages. This is one of the problems with the expansionist sort of internationalist democratic model that they are pursuing. Not that I'm against, democracy or against classical liberalism, but I believe that these things have to be tempered with realism. You can't just go charging around the globe invading other countries for democracy, especially if your democracy at home ain't looking so hot. It undermines your entire moral argument. Anyway, if you got to the end of the video and you enjoyed this, please like, share, and subscribe. We do a live stream, 8 p.m. London time, which I know is like a bit fucking weird because of all the daylight savings, on Rumble every Thursday. Come along and join us, and I guess I'll see you in a couple of days. Oh, and if you like this video and if you disagree and you think I'm a Putla supporter, comment down below. And if you, think opposite, comment down below. I'll read all of them, even though I'll probably ignore like 80% of it, because every single time I do a video on anything to do with Russia, I get a whole bunch of people commenting like, oh, why don't you just like suck on Putin's dick down? And I just, I don't know what to say, mate. Like, I'm just trying to describe the situation on the ground as I see it. There seem to be a lot of people who, really, they don't want any kind of like reality to intrude, but that's the way the cookie crumbles. See you later. Good night.